Louis Theroux just made a documentary about the Manosphere. It is, by the standards of the genre, a good documentary. He got access, he got the influencers to talk. He sat across from Myron Gaines, Sneako, HS TikTok, Justin Waller and Ed Matthews and let them perform themselves into absurdity.
People ask me why Miami, and I tell them because if it was 120 years ago, I'd be on a horse on the way to California to dig for gold. It's in me, I love it.
You're not that guy, pal, trust me. You're not that guy.
The reviews are in, the consensus is clear. These men are clowns. These men are dangerous. These men are, and this is the word that keeps coming up, pathetic. And the consensus is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because here is what nobody seems to be asking. If the Manosphere is so transparently ridiculous, if these men are so obviously fraudulent,
I'm doing it for money. I don't care about
the morality of it.
I'm not living for other people, I'm living for myself.
Then why is it bigger than ever? Why are millions of young men not just watching this content, but organizing their lives around it? Because the answer has almost nothing to do with the influencers. These men were drowning long before anyone offered to sell them a life raft. And what we're about to walk through, the data, the pipeline, the 9 minutes it takes an algorithm to radicalize a child, the 29-point political swing that nobody saw coming, and the 2 words from a grieving young man that should have been the entire documentary, none of it starts with Andrew Tate. It starts with a question nobody thought to ask. So, Theroux's film does what Theroux always does. He gets the subjects to reveal themselves, and they do. They never stop performing. Every sentence is a pitch, every gesture is branding, every movement is curated for the invisible audience behind the lens.
That car is not success. I do want to say that. That car, fuck that car. I might be an asshole in some areas, or people might not agree with some views I have, but I'm not so foolish to believe that's success.
Well, maybe so let's not make too big a thing of it.
No, but just on the record.
I got it.
I don't. That's all.
Thank you.
Justin Waller brags about his one-way monogamy, while his wife, pregnant with their 3rd child, describes her role as staying in her lane.
We don't cross into each other's lane.
Myron Gaines tells Theroux that he loves women and actually understands them and therefore knows what's best for them. Sneako delivers an unprompted rant about the Rothschilds and Satanism outside of a New York bodega.
Do you think Satanists are running the world?
Absolutely.
Harrison Sullivan, HS TikTok, calls his female friend his dishwasher, says that he'd disown a gay son, and then admits his mother would be disappointed. When Theroux meets that mother, she initially pushes back against her son's views before turning on Theroux himself, telling him, "You've done it just to get a reaction." These moments land. They are revealing. They are, in their own way, devastating. But the most important moment in the documentary isn't one of the influencers talking. It's one of the followers. You see, Theroux meets a young fan of Waller's whose brother died by suicide, and this young man tells Theroux that he doesn't believe that depression exists. And then he offers a philosophy that he's learned from these men. We are not meant to be happy. As men, we're meant to suffer. We need to hold that sentence in our minds, because that should have been the documentary. That is the wound. That is a boy who has absorbed from the only men who bothered to speak to him the idea that his pain is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured. That boy is the story, and the documentary moved on. Now, Theroux himself, in an interview promoting the film, came closer to the real story than the documentary ever did. He observed that the influencers were, almost universally, men who had grown up in chaotic or traumatic environments. That what they were doing was, his words, evangelizing an outlook they created as a survival strategy. That the warrior ethos and you against the world mentality was armor built in childhood and never taken off. So he identified the wound. He described the mechanism. And then the documentary didn't follow it. It showed us the armor. It didn't show us what's underneath.
I've had quite a bit from the right saying, like, why is he not focusing on Muslim misogyny? That's quite a big thing. Like, and that's the sort of, I guess, almost Elon type framing would be, I'm following a woke agenda.
Speaking of framing, a story that perfectly illustrates this caught my attention recently. Ghislaine Maxwell appeals for clemency from Trump as she declines to answer questions from lawmakers. The facts are simple, right? Maxwell appeared before Congress, refused to answer questions, and offered to testify about Trump's innocence in exchange for mercy.
I therefore invoke my right to silence under the 5th Amendment to the US Constitution.
But what different outlets do with those same facts is remarkable. If you want to follow along, head to ground.news/rationality, because the breakdown on this one is fascinating. Ground News shows me that this story has been covered by 370 different sources, 71 leaning left, 61 leaning right, and 131 from the center. If you're unfamiliar, Ground News is a website and app designed to make reading the news easier and more data-driven. Every day, they gather thousands of news articles from across the world and organize them by story, each presented with visual breakdowns of the reporting bias, reliability, and ownership, all to help you understand why you're seeing what you're seeing. Look at how this single word choice changes the entire story. Bossip, a left-leaning outlet with mixed factuality, leads with quid pro quo. So before you've processed the details, they've told you this is a corrupt deal. WLT Report, far right with low factuality, headlines it as Ghislaine Maxwell clears President Trump's name, with clears in all caps. She's not bargaining, she's vindicating the president. Same deposition, opposite narrative. Then there's the center, represented by the New Hampshire Union leader and the press of Atlantic City, rated with high and very high factuality, respectively, who simply report Maxwell declines to answer questions. No judgment, just what happened. And notice, the factuality rating lines up almost perfectly with the amount of spin. The most neutral language comes with the highest rated sources. That's exactly the kind of pattern that Ground News makes visible at a glance. If you like what you see, know that you can get 40% off their Vantage plan at ground.news/rationality or scan the QR code on screen. Signing up not only supports transparent media, but also this channel. Thanks. Unsurprisingly, then, the standard take on the Manosphere goes like this. Bad influencers are exploiting impressionable young men. The solution is deplatforming, education, and condemnation. This framing is shared by most of the critical responses to Theroux's documentary and by the overwhelming majority of media commentary. And it is not wrong, but it treats millions of young men as blank slates, passive receivers of bad ideas, rather than as people experiencing something that makes those ideas resonate. And I'm not the only one, of course, who has spotted it. Researchers at the University of Birmingham said after watching the documentary that it completely missed out the reason men are turning to the Manosphere in the first place. That these young men feel abandoned and have no guidance in modern society. That the influencers construct a sense of community and belonging through motivational messages and the endorsement of rigid masculine ideals, which they describe as declining in modern society. The documentary looked at the sellers, it never seriously examined why there are so many buyers. So, let's do what the documentary didn't. Let's look at the buyers. I can start with myself, because I should have been one of them. I went through foster care. My mother was completely absent and an alcoholic, abusively so. My father worked on the oil rigs. He was there periodically, but for almost all of my childhood, he was gone. His idea of being a father was financial support, not emotional support. And that is the biography of half the Manosphere's leadership. It is the biography, in some variation, of a significant portion of its audience. The daddy issue isn't a footnote. It is the engine. And the data confirms it beyond my own experience. In 1970, 79% of British children lived with both biological parents during their childhood. Today, that figure has fallen to 56%. Boys, specifically, are adversely affected by the absence of a father figure. And if they don't find one at home, they are unlikely to find one at school. 85% of primary school teachers are female. So think about that. No father at home, no male figure at school. And into that vacuum, a poll by Hope Not Hate found that 80% of British boys aged 16 to 17 had consumed Andrew Tate content. Only 60% had heard of the Prime Minister. More boys recognize a man currently facing sex trafficking charges than recognizing the person running their country. The role model vacuum isn't a theory, it is a measured reality. And Andrew Tate filled it because no one else was in the room. But it's not just my past that makes me a candidate, it's my present. I am someone who goes to the gym. I love the gym. I like debating. I like self-improvement. These are the exact spaces the Manosphere has colonized, the entry points, the front doors. And I understand why. Because when you're a man who has no control over his education, his employment, his relationships, you walk into a gym and you discover the one domain in your life where effort produces visible results. Your body responds. Progress is tangible. People see you differently. You see you differently. And that feeling of agency, the first taste of control, is when the Manosphere meets you in the one place that you've already started investing in yourself. And I have watched the Manosphere poison every single one of those spaces. I've watched gym culture curdle from a community of people pushing each other to be better into a recruitment pipeline for misogyny. I've watched debate spaces, places where I learnt to think, become proving grounds for men who confuse cruelty with integrity. My natural instinct, when I see what these men have become, is to call them scum. Because here's what gets me. You were trodden on. You were abandoned, neglected, failed by the people who were supposed to love you. And your response is to tread on the other half of the human race. How fucking dare you? That's not how you would have reached me. And I know it because I understand what the Manosphere actually is. It isn't actually an ideology, but rather a life raft. A terrible, leaking, toxic life raft. But it floats. And until someone builds a better one, young men are going to keep climbing onto it. The question is, what are they drowning in? It begins, unsurprisingly, with school. Women now make up nearly 60% of total undergraduate enrollment in the United States. Boys graduate high school at 83% compared to 89% for girls. And that gap holds in every single US state except for Vermont. Internationally, boys are 50% more likely than girls to fail at all three key school subjects: maths, reading, and science. And according to the Brookings Institute, the average American boy at age 5 is 16% points less likely to be school ready than the average girl. And that gap persists and in many cases widens throughout their entire education. So, just to be clear about what this means, the gender gap in education is now larger than it was 50 years ago. It's just reversed, and almost nobody talks about it. Richard Reeves, a Brookings Institute scholar and the author of Boys and Men, has been sounding this alarm for years. His assessment is blunt. He told Northwestern University that "I think that we have learned that the education system has been structured to favor girls rather than boys. Not because anyone set out to hurt boys, but because decades of justified focus on girls' achievements never included a check on whether boys were keeping up." He describes how the early focus on literacy puts boys behind from the start. They're behind in reception, still behind several grades later, and just get further behind. And one consequence, and this is the part that connects directly to our story, is that Reeves warns that boys may come to see educational success itself as feminine. Once that identity locks in, you have a vicious cycle that feeds directly into the Manosphere's narrative. School isn't for you. The system wasn't built for you. You are on your own.
I think the modern education system is nothing but an indoctrination machine. I think they use it to indoctrinate the youth. I think it's a waste of fucking time.
What, to brainwash people?
To brainwash people, of course they do.
Nobody checked whether boys were keeping up. They weren't. And an entire industry was waiting to tell them why. But the education gap is only the first floor of this building. Because if boys fall behind in school, what happens when they try to get a job? Now, what I'm going to walk through is not a claim that women have it better. I want to make that clear. Women fought for decades to close gaps that were real and still persist in boardrooms, in pay, and in representation. But while we were watching that progress and celebrating it, rightfully, something else was happening that almost nobody measured. Men's real wages have declined by 14% since 1979. 9 million prime-aged men were out of labour force even before COVID. Not retired, not in education, just gone. Absent from the entire economy. And here's the thing. For the men who did everything right, who got the degree, who followed the script, the reward is evaporating. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland found that the unemployment gap between college-educated and high school-educated young workers has narrowed to near record lows. Not because non-graduates are doing better, but because graduates are doing worse. And if you want to know what that looks like for an individual level, NBC News profiled a 25-year-old man named Emmanuel Barcinas, who graduated with a computer science degree from the Illinois Institute of Technology. 2 years out of college, unemployed. Living with his parents in suburban Chicago. He has applied to more than 900 jobs, from engineering positions to secretary roles to a job at a prison, and received a handful of interviews. "I want to be an adult," he told NBC. "I need to lock in, I need to move forward, but right now, I'm just stunted." That is the starting profile of the Manosphere's customer base. A man who did what he was told and discovered that the script no longer works. He isn't in the Manosphere, He's one bad evening away from it. And the traditional pathway to male adulthood, education, job, income, family, identity, is breaking at every joint. For working class men, the collapse is catastrophic. Richard Reeves' research found that working class men's deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, alcohol-related death have exploded over the last 3 decades. The share of working class men with children at home has dropped from 67% in 1980 to 51%. 1 in 3 working men now reaches 40 without ever having been married. And young working class men, aged 25 to 34-year-olds, are now more likely to die than middle-aged non-working class men, aged 45 to 54. I mean, let that register. A 30-year-old working class man has a higher chance of dying than a 50-year-old man who isn't working class. Reeves borrows a phrase from the scholar Shelley Lundberg to describe these men: unburdened and unmoored. The Manosphere offers them a burden and a mooring. It is the wrong one, but it is, for many of them, the only one on offer. So, falling behind in school, locked out of work, but surely they have someone to talk to about it. No. And this really is the part of the story that should frighten you, because everything I've described so far, the education, the employment, those are bad enough in their own regard. But they also create the conditions for what comes next. Remember, boys are already learning to see education and emotional literacy as feminine. The Manosphere is already teaching them that vulnerability is weakness. Not even a disciplined stoic sense, but in a way that shuts down reflection entirely. So, by the time these young men reach the age where friendships require emotional maintenance, where you actually have to pick up the phone and say, "Bro, I'm not okay," they don't have the tools. The previous failures took the tools away. And that makes this next part the deepest layer of the crisis, because you cannot fix it without fixing everything above it first. The Survey Center of American Life found that the percentage of men reporting 0 close friends has increased 5-fold since 1990. In a 2023 study in Equimundo, 2/3 of men aged 18 to 23 agreed with the statement, "No one really knows me." 2/3. The loneliness data is more nuanced than the headlines suggest. Pew Research Center's 2025 report found that men and women report roughly similar levels of loneliness. About 16% of each say they feel lonely all or most of the time. So the crisis isn't necessarily that men are lonelier on the average day. It's that when things go wrong, and for the men we've been describing, things are going wrong very often, men have almost nothing to fall back on. The same Pew data shows that women are far more likely to have built the kind of emotional infrastructure that catches you when life collapses. 54% of women would turn to a friend for emotional support, compared to 38% of men. 44% of women would turn to a family member, versus 26% of men. And men are less likely to seek help from a mental health professional, 16% compared to 22% of women.
And we don't believe in depression also.
Meaning?
We don't believe in it.
Remember this young man. His brother killed himself, and he has been taught by the only men who spoke to him that the thing that killed his brother doesn't exist. So what this means in practice is that an enormous number of men are funneling their entire emotional infrastructure through a single relationship. When that relationship exists, they cope. When it ends, and for the growing number of young men who have never had one, they have nothing. No friend to call, no language for what they're feeling, no cultural permission to say, "I am struggling." The Manosphere walks into that silence and starts talking. It doesn't offer therapy, no. It offers identity, a vocabulary, a community, a framework that says, you're not broken, the world is broken. You don't need help, you need power. It is entirely the wrong answer. But for a generation of men who have never been asked the question, it is the only answer in the room. And this is the part that matters most, because the answer doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in stages. And understanding those stages is the key to understanding why it works. Now, nobody wakes up and decides to hate women. That's not how the Manosphere recruits. It recruits the very same way that successful radicalization pipelines have always recruited, through graduated escalation. A boy is lonely, he's struggling in school, or he's been rejected, or he just doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing with his life. He opens up TikTok, he watches a gym video. The algorithm notices. It sends him another gym video. Then a self-improvement video, how to be more confident, how to dress, how to talk to girls. And this content is often genuinely useful. That is the trick. The front door looks like help. Then the tone shifts. The self-improvement becomes self-assertion. Confidence becomes dominance. Be a better man becomes women don't respect weak men. Dating advice becomes sexual strategy. Self-help becomes ideology. And by the time the boy reaches the Andrew Tates and the Myron Gaineses, he's already been primed. He's already absorbed the vocabulary. Alpha, beta, red pill, high-value male. He didn't jump from normal to extreme. He was walked there one recommendation at a time. Research from a Tyler and Francis study on former red pillers found exactly this pattern. The most common argument for being attracted to Manosphere communities was that the young men felt vulnerable. They experienced dating failures, loneliness, or difficult home lives, and discovered the Manosphere while genuinely trying to improve themselves. Their loneliness, once inside the echo chamber, transformed into anger as they embraced a misogynistic worldview. And here's what seals it. While all of this is happening, while the tips are working, while his skin is clearing up, while he's getting stronger and getting more attention, the world outside the pipeline is confirming everything the pipeline told him. He goes online and he sees think pieces saying that men's problems aren't real. He sees discussions telling him that he's not worthy of consideration. He sees the very struggles that drove him to the gym in the first place being dismissed as privilege or fragility. And every time that happens, every single time, it validates not just the good advice that the Manosphere gave him, the skincare, the gym routine, the confidence, but the terrible advice too. The misogyny, the rage, the ideology. Because if the outside world won't even acknowledge his pain, then maybe the men who did acknowledge it were right about everything else as well. Let me give you a quick example of what this contamination looks like. Take Joey Swoll, a fitness influencer who built his platform on gym positivity. He calls out bullying. He defends people from being mocked during workouts. But he also does something else. He covers women who go into gyms, film themselves, and then complain that men are looking at them, despite filming in a way that draws every eye in the room. And he calls it out. Rightly. It's good content. It's fair content. But that content gets co-opted. It gets fed into an algorithm alongside everything else. And it is so effective at generating engagement that it gets served to audiences who aren't watching for gym etiquette. They're watching for ammunition against women. Swoll has had to explicitly push back against this multiple times. He said that anyone trying to use my words, videos, platform, or my message as an excuse to harass, body shame, or demean anyone of any gender is no friend or follower of mine. Good for him. A genuine legend. But do you know what? It hardly registers, and that's not his fault. The algorithm doesn't care about intent. It cares about engagement. And engagement flows downstream, from gym motivation to gym conflict to gender wars to full Manosphere ideology. Every space that young men occupy, fitness, gaming, self-improvement, debate, has been colonized by this machinery. Not because those spaces are inherently toxic, but because the algorithm identified them as the most efficient delivery mechanism for content that keeps people watching. And the scale of it, when you see the data, is something I genuinely don't think most people have grasped. A study at DCU's Anti-Bullying Center set up blank phones simulating teenage boys. No history, no preferences, just accounts that looked like a 16-year-old interested in gym content, sports, and video games. So not the Manosphere, just boy things. On TikToks, the accounts were recommending Manosphere content within 9 minutes, on YouTube Shorts within 17 minutes. And after 2 to 3 hours of viewing, the length of a quiet evening, 76% to 78% of all recommended content was toxic. So once the account showed interest by watching Manosphere content, the amount rapidly increased. The algorithm accelerated the pipeline. Let that land. A child did not go looking for Andrew Tate. The algorithm delivered Andrew Tate to a child. The pipeline is an engineering system, and it is more efficient at reaching young men than any government, school, or institution has ever been. So, that's the mechanism. And if you're wondering what it produces when it runs at scale in 2024, we found out. In the 2024 US presidential election, young men who had backed Joe Biden by 15 points in 2020 swung to Donald Trump by 14 points, a 29-point shift in 4 years. The gender gap among voters aged 18 to 29 hit 31 points. Young women favored Kamala Harris by 17 points. Young men favored Trump by 14 points. And get this, young white men backed Trump by 28 points. Let's sit with those numbers for a while. A 31-point gap between young men and young women within the same generation, within the same classrooms and families. And it goes deeper than votes. NBC News polling found that young women and young men are building entirely different definitions of what a good life looks like. Young men who voted for Trump rated having children as their top measure of personal success. Young women who voted for Harris ranked it second to last. Young women ranked emotional stability as a priority. Young men who voted for Trump ranked it near the bottom. These are not just political differences, these are different civilizations forming inside the same generation. And here's the thing. Sociologists and anthropologists have seen this before. When any demographic group finds itself falling behind in education, shut out of employment, and cut off from meaningful connection at the same time, the same thing happens. Every time. They gravitate towards rigid ideological frameworks that offer certainty. They seek hierarchical structures that give them a defined place. They become susceptible to strongmen figures who promise to restore an order where they mattered, even if the order never existed. And they turn against whatever group they're told is responsible for their decline. That is not merely a description of the Manosphere, it is a description of every radicalization pattern in history. The Manosphere is simply the latest version of something these researchers can see coming from a mile off. And that is what makes the failure to address it so damning. Because the people who study this for a living knew exactly who was vulnerable and exactly what would happen. The question isn't why these young men fell, it's why nobody caught them. And into that vacuum, Trump won these men by doing the one thing nobody else bothered to do. He showed up, he appeared on their podcasts, spoke to their streamers, and said, I see you. And then his administration dressed up every political goal in the language of those grievances. Corporate tax cuts became letting you keep more of what you've earned. Deregulation became getting the government off your back. And when they needed a culture war target, something to channel the anger towards, they chose the most vulnerable people they could find. Trans people, immigrants, women's reproductive rights, each one critically, carefully framed as a threat to the masculinity these men were already terrified of losing. The policy agenda arrived pre-translated, gift-wrapped in the only language anyone had bothered to speak to them in. The Manosphere is the cultural expression. The vote is the political expression. They are the same signal, transmitted on different frequencies. And if you ignore the signal because you don't like where it's coming from, it doesn't go away. It gets louder. Look, the standard progressive response to the male crisis has been one of two things. The first is straight up denial. Men are still privileged, the system still favours them, their problems are overstated and self-inflicted. The second is contempt. Men are getting what they deserve. Their loneliness is a consequence epidemic, their struggles are the result of refusing to adapt. Both responses contain elements of truth, but both are factually incomplete. And both are politically catastrophic. Because here is what happens when you tell a generation of men who are falling behind in school, struggling to find work, disconnected from friends, invisible to institutions, and algorithmically delivered to the worst possible mentors, when you tell those men that their problems aren't real, or that their problems are their own fault, they believe you. Not about the problems being fake, no. They believe you when you demonstrate through your indifference that you don't care about them. And then they go where someone does, even if that someone is Andrew Tate.
Go into the bathroom and look in the mirror, look deep in your eyes and say, yeah, I wouldn't fuck me either.
Even if that someone is a grifter selling a fantasy of dominance to men who can't get a text back. Richard Reeves has said that these problems won't go away on their own. They're going to fester if we don't address them. He has also observed that there is a real reluctance on the left even to discuss these issues, for fear that will somehow be seen as signalling less support for the continued efforts on behalf of women and girls. And that is a completely false choice. You can care about women's equality and also notice that boys are drowning. You can condemn the Manosphere and also ask why it has so many customers. You can despise Andrew Tate and still have compassion for the 17-year-old watching him at 2 a.m. because nobody else is talking. But we don't. We ridicule them. We ridicule the influencers. We mock the followers. And the Manosphere gets bigger every year without failure, because contempt is not a strategy. It is a recruitment tool. for the other side. Louis Theroux made a good documentary. He showed us the grifters, he showed us the performance, the bravado, the fragile egos propped up by rented Lamborghinis and paid for women. All of that is true. All of it needed to be shown. But the grifters, they're not the story. The story is the young man standing before Justin Waller, whose brother killed himself, who has absorbed from the only men who ever spoke to him the belief that as a man, he is meant to suffer. The story is the boy in suburban Chicago with a computer science degree and 900 rejected applications. The story is the 16-year-old who opened a TikTok to watch a gym video and was 9 minutes away from Andrew Tate. The story is 2/3 of young men agreeing with the sentence, "No one really knows me," and nobody asking them to say more. The Manosphere is not a cause. It is a consequence. It is what fills the space when every other institution has either abandoned young men or decided they are not worth the political risk of helping. And it will keep growing. It will metastasize through gyms and gaming lobbies and debate forums and TikTok feeds until someone, somewhere, offers these men something better than Andrew Tate.
If you feel depressed, gee, you're going to spill fucking coffee and you're ruining my Tate speech. Piss off.
Something better. A community, a purpose, a single credible voice that says, I see that you're struggling, and it's not because you're broken. But right now, the only people saying that are the worst people in the world, and they're winning. Not because they're right, but because they showed up, and nobody else did. So what's the answer? I've been sitting with that question for a long time. And honestly, after all the data, all the research, all the statistics, it comes down to something almost embarrassingly straightforward. The answer, at its most basic, is absurdly simple. It's a man, any man, turning to a younger one and saying, I see that you're struggling. And that is allowed. That's it. That is the entire competing offer. A mentor, a coach, a teacher who stays back after class, an older brother who picks up the phone. The Manosphere has industrialized that impulse and poisoned it. But the impulse itself, the need to be seen by another man, is not the problem. It is, in fact, the solution. We just need to get there first. So, in effect, I'm starting a campaign. Be more arrogant.